On March 7, 1965, protesters, in a valiant attempt to obtain voting rights for black men, marched 54 miles, beginning in Selma, Alabama, and concluding in Montgomery, Alabama, were tragically tear-gassed, assaulted, and shot at after being confronted by the local authorities. The protest was a turning point in the civil rights movement, which brought awareness to Americans, was a major factor in the end of segregation, and allowed for people to triumphantly view each other as equals today. Although the Selma to Montgomery March was vital, the events leading up to it were arguably just as important, if not more. They led to the culmination of anger in all, building up tension and indignation until a breaking point. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in voting based on race. However, when civil rights organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, among others, attempted to register black voters, they were met with fierce resistance in southern states, such as Alabama and Georgia. Despite this, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC decided to make Selma, a small rural town located in Dallas County, Alabama, the focus of the campaign for voter registration. The governor of Alabama, Governor George Wallace, was an infamous adversary against the end of segregation, and the local county sheriff in Dallas County had led an adamant resistance to black voter registration drives. As a result of this antagonism, only about 2% of Selma's eligible black voters, or 300 out of the 15,000 in town, had managed to register. In the opinion of many credited historians, 1963 was one of the most pivotal years in the civil rights movement. In this year, the Children's Crusade occurred, the stand in the schoolhouse door took place, John F. Kennedy's civil rights speech was made, and more. However, the most notable event of the year was clearly the March on Washington, in which Martin Luther King made his famous I Have a Dream speech, inspiring many activists.
He conveyed the message to the rest of the world, but we didn't think he was actually doing enough. And now I would say that the speech is a beautiful statement of the world we wanted to see.
And so just the fact that he helped direct the resources of SCLC towards this local voting rights movement was incredibly important. And he also articulated the demands in a way that got the attention not only of the national media but also internationally.
Right. Okay.
There were many motivations that essentially prompted the marches. The death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African-American protesting peacefully in Marion, was a major trigger for the marches. He was an activist who simply attempted to defend his mother from an Alabama state trooper's nightstick, but was shot and died unfortunately 8 days later in a Selma hospital.
The evidence was there, the worldwide attention was there, and I think all those things came together. And in terms of American history, it's incredibly meaningful.
The direct impetus was the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, was the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, because that's what kind of really got the wheels turning for this planned march.
The 14th Amendment, which gives us the Equal Protection Clause, and the 15th Amendment, which extends the right to vote to black men, in many ways sort of laid the groundwork to sort of already enshrine the voting rights that people should have been able to exercise. And of course, it's the denial of those rights to exercise those votes, to be able to exercise those rights to vote, that finally kind of spur people.
After decades of remaining silent on their rights, civil rights activists such as Martin Luther King Jr. and many other familiar, influential faces in history gathered to work towards a solution. As a result, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC began planning a 54-mile protest, not only to avenge Jimmy Lee Jackson, but also to obtain voting rights for African Americans. With Jimmy Lee Jackson, King's inspiring words, the media support, and the success of the movement thus far, hundreds of activists made the risky decision to protest. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, 600 people set out from the small town of Selma, Alabama. Unfortunately, they were quickly met by Alabama state troopers only 6 blocks away at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They had a vast arsenal of weapons, including whips, nightsticks, and tear gas. This was called Bloody Sunday, the first of 3 marches known as the March from Selma to Montgomery. Protesters were whipped, hit, and tear gassed. This event was broadcasted to the nation, enraging many. Due to Bloody Sunday, many more people joined the movement, including religious leaders and people of all races. These peaceful protesters were met by the authorities, who went to extensive measures to stop them from marching. The troopers harmed many of the protesters by shoving them, knocking them to the ground, and beating them with nightsticks. many were tear gassed, while others were charged by troopers on horseback. Although the FBI was supposed to protect all people, they simply watched and did not interrupt the persecution.
So the FBI, although they're, kind of in a formal sense, were tasked with helping to protect the marchers, their role was a bit more ambivalent, let's say, in as far as the positive contributions.
Trying to register, just beat them savagely. And across the street, you had FBI agents taking notes day after day.
Additionally, the KKK was involved. John Lewis, the leader of this protest, was badly beaten by the authorities. He was hospitalized for a fractured skull.
I thought over and over again, they're going to arrest us. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses. I went down on my knees. My legs went out from under me. I thought I was going to die.
Even reports of a rubber hose that somebody wrapped in barbed wire and used as a weapon. The African Americans were being treated like outcasts and were essentially isolated from the rest of society. This march exemplified the unjust treatment of African Americans by not only the authorities, but by others. The local authorities were supposed to account for the well-being of all citizens despite their race. After retreating to Selma and regrouping, protesters continued to the bridge with gang support. Martin Luther King Jr., with the help of many other leaders, obtained permission from a nearby court for their final march. This march, taking place on March 21st, had approximately 3,200 activists. They slept in fields and walked about 12 miles each day. Picking up more people along the way, they reached Montgomery with more than 25,000 people. The people, who were being threatened every day, persevered in the face of adversity.
When you ask people that will register to vote back in that time period, under those circumstances, you're asking someone to risk their life.
Threats of death, as well as threats against loved ones, were unable to halt the efforts of these strong people. Not only were African Americans united, but other races selflessly came together in an effort to end segregation. Religious leaders played a key role in the march as well, bringing more awareness to it.
And more importantly, a whole host of ministers and rabbis, and a huge segment of the religious community, and people who had traveled from all over the country to come down to Selma and to swell the ranks into the many, many thousands as they approached the Capitol in Montgomery.
They were able to unite for one cause and follow the eminent allies of the movement. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., along with President Lyndon B. Johnson, greatly contributed to the end of segregation. With so many supporters, the fight began to become a strength in numbers battle. Thus, the unity that came from the march was not only in the Black community, but in the nation as a whole.
Because by engaging non-violent civil disobedience with violence, they were allowing the nation to see the moral high ground upon which the civil rights movement was attempting to purchase.
After the march, there were many monumental moments for the civil rights movement. The demonstration, being a major political and emotional point in the movement, prompted many amendments to the government. For instance, soon after the protesters reached Montgomery, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. African Americans were granted the right to vote, and they achieved another successful march, bringing them one step closer to the end of segregation. From the marches from Selma to Montgomery, African Americans, along with the entire country, were able to benefit in some way. After realizing how truly catastrophic the march was, the government became more aware of the extent of the issue. With this event documented all around the country and still spoken about today, the Selma to Montgomery March was a key factor in the ending of major segregation in America. Thus, through the voices of activists of all ages, the sacrifice of innocent lives, and the hard work of thousands of people, segregation was finally put to an end.